Hello and welcome to the Physiology of Singing, Singing, Singing. Yeah. And so it is part 2, second video of my acoustics stuff. What? Because, singing is essentially creating sound, hopefully desirable sound that people will pay money for you to create. And and acoustics is the study of sound. So, stands to reason that singers and voice teachers should probably know a little something about it. And there are a lot of overlapping terms that people use in these fields, right? Like resonance, harmonics, formants, And I just want to try to parse out the confusion over some of those things and sort of demystify them essentially for singers and voice teachers just so that they have a better idea. Just in case, if you ever happen to be the kind of person who wants to look at articles of people who study these kind of phenomena, if you have some idea of how specific like the actual real concepts are, or how specific the terms, like what they actually really mean in those articles, then you'll be able to understand them a little more rather than just, being confused or having to like look up every other word, because that's never fun. So in the last video, I really emphasized that sound is a physical phenomenon. It's, you're actually talking about real air molecules really moving in a pattern that is a sound wave, okay? And I use that analogy of people standing in line for an amusement park ride, So that's the analogy I got. I'm totally going to personify the air molecules because why not? It makes sense to me that way. So if you have a bunch of people standing in line, okay, the sound wave is akin to like a kid getting really excited and running up to the back of the line and bumping into the person in the back of the line. And then that makes that person bump into the person in front of them, and that person bumps into the person in front of them, and you have this little domino effect. But of course, if you're somebody who gets like bumped into someone in front of you, you're gonna like back way away from that person, right? Like when you try to right yourself, you're probably gonna overcorrect a second and be like, whoa, didn't mean to bump into you, before you end up in your comfortable position. And so when you think of air molecule displacement in sound waves, it's essentially that. So you getting kind of up in the stranger in front of you space, that's the part of where it's called the compression part of the sound wave. So that's when the air molecules are a little too close for comfort with their neighbors, okay? They get a little close, and then they're like, whoa, didn't mean to get that close. And that's the rarefaction part, where they're a little more spread apart, okay? And when it comes to amplitude of sound waves, it really just has to do with how displaced that is. So using this line analogy, it's like, did you get sort of bumped into their space a little to the point where you're just a little uncomfortable? You were a little too close for comfort. You didn't actually really have to touch them, though, and then you back away from them? Or did you actually get like slammed into them, like you were knocked off balance and you actually came into contact with the person in front of you? So a higher amplitude sound wave is, once again, going with my personification of the molecules, is where the molecules essentially get bumped into the people in front of, the molecules in front of them, and they're like, ugh, and then they're like, oh my god, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do that, and you would back way far away, right? So the rarefaction would be a little, right, there's a little more spread between the two, and the compression is tighter. So softer sound waves, like reduced sound waves with less amplitude, so softer, essentially, from what you hear, would be where essentially they just kind of got up in the business, like kind of invaded the personal space of the molecules in front of them, rather than actually getting like bumped into them, okay? So a little less displacement. So that gives you some sense of amplitude anyway, of how the air molecules are displaced, what I mean when I say displaced from the air molecules. Think of like people standing in line for an amusement park ride and somebody bumps into the person behind them. And then I also mentioned, this is just a slight review, I also mentioned that this also gives you a little understanding of why sound waves are different than aerodynamics, because, if the kid bumps into the back of the line, you don't expect that kid to just end up at the front of the line due to bumping into people, right? Like, no, that doesn't make any sense. You do expect the bumping, the little domino effect that they create, to go throughout that line a little bit. So that bumping, that little domino effect, that's the sound wave traveling in space, okay? That's the displacement of air molecules. It's this row gets displaced, and then that row, and then that row, and then that row, and then that row, and travels on from there. And aerodynamics, or just the movement of air molecules, like in wind or in breath, like if you're blowing out candles, okay? You know, you're talking, that would be more like the kid who did the initial running into, where do they end up, right? Like if it was just wind, it's like they would just blow past the line and ended up standing in the front of the line. And then everybody really ticked off, but nah. So yeah, but it's not quite like that, right? So that gives you some idea, like if you're blowing out smoke, if you see a smoker who's like blowing out smoke out of their mouth, or you can see your exhale if it's a cold day outside and you're blowing that out, what you're looking at is aerodynamics at that point, not acoustics, okay? You're not looking at sound wave. Sound travels a lot faster, which also makes more sense instinctually, because if someone's talking to you from like 5 feet across the room, you hear their voice, you hear the sound waves hitting your eardrums and sending that signal into your inner ear and then up to your brain. You get to hear that. But what you probably don't feel is their breath coming out of their body, right? From 5 feet away. That would be kind of weird. And hopefully you don't smell their breath, because seriously, if you can smell breath from 5 feet away, I think the person who has that breath needs to probably see a doctor, because there might be something a little off with their oral flora. You know, the little microscopic dudes who live in your mouth, they might be a little off, because that would be really weird to smell breath from 5 feet away. And hopefully if you're their friend, you would actually tell them, like, I think, yeah, that's not okay. All right, so there's that. I also talked about resonance being a physical phenomenon created by standing waves, or just when waves interfere with each other. So as something vibrates, like a string is vibrating, or as these air molecules are displaced, okay, you know, eventually the air molecules are going to hit some sort of boundary, or the string itself is going to hit a boundary, right? Like if you're talking about like a guitar string, right? It has two ends. And so when the wave hits that boundary, it can reflect back, okay? So it goes back, and if it hits the boundary at the right point in the wave, right? So like if the guitar string gets plucked and the guitar string like is, you know, I'm trying to figure out how to do this. So my hands are going to be a guitar string, okay? So consider my wrists like the 2 points where the string is attached, okay? So if you pluck it, it's going to essentially do this. This is the slow-mo, up and down, right? And where it hits, like as long as it's doing that, because of the boundaries right there, it's going to reflect back. And then that becomes even bigger. So it sums, essentially. And those ends at the points are considered nodes in that standing wave. So it ends up looking like it's just, you know, doing a really big movement there. Nodes being like 0 points, like points where you're not going to have additional displacement there, okay? It's just right there. So that's resonance. Resonance is actually like sound waves summing or interfering somehow, okay? You can have destructive interference where sound waves cancel each other out, and you can have constructive where they tend to sum together and their amplitude, it gets even bigger. You get more displacement of the molecules, okay? So it's like having, you know, I don't know, 2 kids shove the back of the line instead of 1. I don't know, something like that. Or maybe like 2 different lines that get shoved at the same time. Okay, there we go. That's a better analogy. So like, it's a ride that has 2 lines next to each other, okay? And they both get, you know, the bump on one reflects back through the other one, and then you end up with this summing. It looks like you have even more displacement, even more movement of people in the lines, okay? So that's resonance. Resonance, the thing for singers that I want you guys to get, though, so like 10 minutes in, I'm getting to the darn point, which is resonance is something that's happening all the time. If you didn't have resonance happening with your voice and with your vocal tract, we wouldn't be able to hear you. So the fact that we can hear each other talk at all means resonance is occurring, okay? So when singers talk about creating resonance, it's not so much that they're creating it out of a vacuum. It's not like you just suddenly create resonance where there was no resonance. It's more like you wanted to create the desired resonance, the sound quality, or the, you know, whatever combination of resonances that happen to mean it's a desirable, professionally viable sound that people will pay you money to produce, right? Or at least invite you to parties or something, okay? People are gonna want you to sing, essentially. So that tends to be the resonance that people talk about. And of course, belting has a very different resonance than opera singing, right? That's why they sound so different from each other. They're just, things are different. The vocal fold vibration might be a little different, but even if that's not that different, the resonance of the vocal tract is definitely different, for sure, right? And so the other little thing about resonance that I think I failed to mention last time, so this might be the better video to watch, quite frankly, is that larger objects are going to resonate at lower frequencies. This is pretty instinctual also for musicians in particular, because when you think about guitar strings, okay, when you string up your guitar, there's a fatter string, right? A string that has more mass. Is that the lower pitch string? Yes, it is. That string has a lower pitch when you pluck it, right? And when you think of, you know, that goes for like violins to violas to cellos to double basses, right? The larger it gets, the lower the instrument. You know, and the strings are larger and all of that, right? You go oboe to bassoon, you go alto sax to bari sax, you go euphonium to tuba, right? Like there's all these examples of essentially you take an instrument and you make it bigger and suddenly it's lower, right? So lower things will resonate at lower frequencies, including like strings with more mass to them, and also air cavities. Larger air cavities are going to resonate at lower frequencies. So, you know, theoretically, if you could get a string of the exact same mass and tension on the violin and on the cello, and you pluck that string on both instruments, the cello is still going to sound different because the body of the cello, the air cavity that's resonating, that's, you know, that's helping to sort of boost that string resonance, is larger. So you're going to hear lower harmonics are going to be strengthened a bit more in the cello versus the violin, right? So string resonance is something people talk about when we talk about vocal folds, because vocal folds also have boundaries at, you know, the front of your throat and the back of your throat. You end up with a boundary. The vocal folds are attached, essentially, right? They're not just like flopping around freely, because that would be really weird. So if you ever want to Google string resonance, the way that relates theoretically to like voice production is talking about vocal folds. So that's talking about the source of the sound, okay? It's not talking about the air space or the air column above. It's not talking about the vocal tract as the filter. That is the source part of the source filter theory. So the source are the vocal folds, which is modeled and thought of as string resonance, okay? And in the world of string resonance, you end up with this equation that I'm not going to go through, but you end up with, you know, there's mass and there's stiffness that affect the pitch, essentially, the fundamental frequency that's going to be put out by the string, okay? This is also pretty instinctual for musicians, I think, because like I said, mass, if you think of any stringed instrument, the fatter string, the string with more mass, is the lower string, right? Tension, pretty instinctual also, because if you ever watch, you know, string instruments tune, or if you play a string instrument yourself and you need to tune it, what do you do if your strings are a little too low? If you're flat, you tighten it, right? You increase the tension of the string, and that hopefully gets your instrument in tune. Hopefully it doesn't just like snap on you or something. Then you gotta replace your string. Okay. So, all right, so as tension increases, pitch goes up. As mass decreases, pitch goes up. Okay, so there are inverse relationships there. With vocal folds, what people are actually talking about are effective mass, because the overall mass of your vocal folds aren't really going to change, right? Like, you know, you're not going to like suddenly be able to have like double the size vocal folds in your throat unless you have something wrong going on there. And if you didn't, it would also be really just weird as a like ability to have. If you were an Xman, it would be like the most probably pointless ability. So just feel, what can you do? I can like just make my vocal folds bigger overall. Check me out. I don't know. Like that would just be so pointless. Anyway, which also makes me think about like, sorry, side note, I love Xmen, but wouldn't it suck to be like in the Xmen world to be like the mutant with like the worst mutant power, like just something you can't fight anybody with it, like it's just kind of this completely pointless power that you have, and then you're like meeting, you know, these super powerful mutants and you're like, hi, you know, that would just suck. Okay, anyway, that would probably be my lot. I would probably be just like this weird mutant with this weird ability. I don't know, like an ability to create more freckles or something, probably. Anyway, so back to actually talking about singing. Let's go back to that. Okay, so where was I? Oh yes, so that's string resonance. You have increased mass or decreased mass raises the fundamental frequency that it'll resonate at, the string will resonate at, and increasing the tension. So in your vocal folds, increasing the tension means either contracting the thyroarytenoid muscle, the actual vocal fold muscle itself can contract and raise the fundamental frequency, which is actually most of how you change your fundamental while you're talking. You don't tend to use your cricothyroid as much when you're talking, the muscle that stretches the vocal folds. That tends to be reserved for if you're really going up a bit. And typically, I mean, you can use it, but it's not used as often for just speaking, regular speaking pitches that people do. But the cricothyroid increases the tension, right? It stretches it. And it decreases the effective mass. And when we talk about effective mass, we talk about the amount of vocal fold contact, essentially. So vocal folds are three-dimensional. You have an underside and a top side. And you can end up with vibration, you know, they blow open from the bottom and then they vibrate in this nice little complex way that creates your complex sound wave, which I'm going to get to in a bit. Maybe I'll have to do another video. So I guess this is a nice reviewer. But as they're doing this, so if you're completely adducted, you know, together, you're going to have, you know, and you have a nice healthy vibration, you can end up with complete, you know, you have this whole mass, like the whole, depth of my hand, essentially, the depth of your vocal folds contacting each other. Increased mass decreases the resonant frequency, and you end up with a lower fundamental. So, okay. So if I try to bottom out my voice, I can just, you know, increase the effective mass, decrease the tension, make them more slack, lower my pitch. Okay. As you increase, as the cricothyroid stretches, typically what tends to happen is you end up with a little decreased effective mass as well. So instead of having the full depth, you end up with just like this much maybe vibrating. So you end up with sort of the maybe upper little portion of the vocal folds vibrating. So that's decreasing effective mass, which helps to elevate the pitch. And then as they tighten also, right, like just stretching them out increases the tension, which also increases the pitch. So this is pretty important if you want to go like really high in your voice. You're probably going to need to do a combo of both. And you're not aware of what you're doing at any given moment in time, like what combination of muscles you're using, honestly. Really, really, really honestly, I mean, I know a lot of singers like to say like, oh, I did that by doing this and this and this with my cricothyroid, but it's like you really can't say that because you have no particular sense for which combination of what you're doing. So instead of thinking that way, I would just encourage you to think, okay, am I producing the fundamental I want? Is it a good quality source? Like, is my source clean and easy, essentially? So is my vocal sound clean? Is it easy? Can I do it well? And then worry about vocal tract, which is where things get little more complicated, actually. And, yeah, stuff gets real, essentially, with technique when you're dealing with vocal tract stuff. So, there is that. So this is already about 20 minutes. I'm going to leave this as, maybe this might end up just becoming the primary video to watch for the introduction into sound stuff. And let me get into harmonics. So I'm going to really focus in on the source filter in the next one. Okay, so keep remembering, big picture from this video. Sound is a physical phenomenon. We're talking about actual displacement patterns of actual air molecules, which are actual physical things, even though you can't see them, so it's not mystical. Resonance is a physical phenomenon about how sound and, you know, how these things are displaced when they hit certain boundaries, and then how those waves reflect and sum together or don't or cancel each other out. So resonance is an actual physical thing. Larger objects resonate at lower pitches. Pretty obvious. So increased mass, lower pitch. In strings, and increased tension elevates the pitch in string. String resonance is how we think of and model and conceptualize the vocal fold vibration. So it has to all do with the sound source in the source filter theory. So string relates to vocal tract, erase that. Strike that, reverse it. String resonance has to do with vocal fold vibration, and the mass and the tension tends to be handled by different combinations of the thyroretinoid contracting and the cricothyroid contracting. Tends to be. And also adduction to a certain extent, but, you know, then we're getting like really complicated with that. So different combos of those muscles in your larynx will create different degrees of effective mass and stiffness of your vocal folds, which change your vocal pitch. And that is a process that should be pretty fluid and should happen pretty easily. So once again, it's all about vocal ease here. It's about woo! It's about being able to do stuff like that really easily, okay? And being able to access your higher range really easily without a ton of cracking and all of that, right? Ideally. Unless you really want to crack. I guess if you're a yodeler, you know, they tend to purposely move into other, to kind of crack their voice into like a falsetto-y sound and stuff, right? I'm not a yodeler, so I'm not going to deno that. Really, I've tried. I play around with it, and it's just, I'm not very good at it. Okay. So, source stuff. If you're ever reading about the source of the source filter theory, think, this has to do with my vocal folds. That's what the research has to do with. It has to do with vocal folds, okay? So source, vocal folds, that has to do with your fundamental, the harmonics, which we'll get into, and string resonance. The resonance of a string is kind of how it tends to be conceptualized, and the mathematical models and all that stuff tends to fall out of that idea of resonance of a string. You can Google resonance of a string and see what we're talking about here, and you can Google resonance of vocal folds and you can see what we're talking about. There's a ton of resources out there if you want to know more, but the main thing is it should just be happening pretty fluidly. It shouldn't be something you're super aware of in terms of how you need to tackle a certain pitch. If you're talking about your usable singable range, you should be talking like pretty easy access to that range. Okay, not like if I really like clench my butt cheeks a certain way, and if I squint my left eye, and if I'm in the right humidity under the right conditions, I can kind of squeak out this note. That's not your professional usable range, right? Because you don't want your professional usable range, the stuff you're going to go on stage and do, you don't want it to be stuff that you have to like cross your fingers and hope it comes out when you're actually in a healthy, pretty healthy state. Right? So that is what I encourage, is that professionally usable range is whatever range of notes you can get to easily. Like roll out of bed, can hit those notes. Yeah! Like that, right? You just want to be able to pop up there. No problems, okay? So there you go. Source, string, blah, 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 all that stuff I just said. This has already gotten kind of long. I can go really long with acoustics because I really like acoustics, so I'm sorry if I'm going a little too long. And if I get a little too off and tangential and I get a little too detailed, please let me know in the comments below and I will try to clarify things. But the truth is, I hate it when people talk down to me with this stuff. I hate it when it becomes so distilled that I have no like conceptual meat to hold on to. So I'm going to do my best to not talk down to folks about this stuff. But that might mean I miss my mark and I end up talking over heads unintentionally. So if I have done that, I apologize. But next up, I actually have a lovely visual illusion for what I want to do. To help you understand like what, we're going to talk about different types of sound waves in terms of simple sound waves, complex, periodic, aperiodic, sounds fancy. Some of you guys might have heard about that. Some of you guys might not have. But I actually have a visual and I'm really excited about it. So stay tuned. Maybe that'll help. I don't know. I hope. Okay. Well, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!